Hey, while Odysseus is on his way home from the Trojan War, I figured we could just take a quick peek over to the rest of Greece and see how the rest of his buddies from the Iliad are doing on their way home. Oh, oh my goodness. Oh, this is not going well. Yeah, so last time when we talked about Telemachus and his coming of age and the moment when Athena inspires him to go out searching for news of his father Odysseus and as he's on his way home, his long 10-year journey home from the Trojan War, I read to you a passage in which Telemachus says, I think with quite a bit of bombast and self-importance for such a young man, he says, other men too lost their day of homecoming at Troy, and he's perfectly right about that. Many people straight up died in the Trojan War, but it's also the case, as he's about to discover when he journeys out into the world, that lots of other people had a really hard homecoming journey as well. Odysseus is the latest and last. He's taken the longest, but we learn as Telemachus ventures out that the aftermath of the Trojan War has been really rough for everybody. And this is the place, maybe most of all, where Homer furnishes the material for all of Greek literature subsequently. I don't know how many times now I've quoted this Aeschylus saying when Aeschylus says that all my tragedies are just slices from the great banquet of Homer. But you're really going to see this week how that's true. And what's so cool about that is it means you're not just reading Homer when you're reading Homer, or any truly great work of Western literature. I'm teaching a college course on Greek now, and one of the things I say to my students is, when you walk into an art museum and you get to the Renaissance paintings and you're in some giant room where everything kind of looks the same, and it's supposed to be great, it's supposed to be high culture, but basically it's just a bunch of naked people running around doing a bunch of stuff. Once you read Homer and once you read the Bible and Dante and Milton, and as you get into this storehouse of the great Western tradition, suddenly those paintings don't all look the same to you, because the world of culture starts to come into focus, and you can tell these different myths that are all lifted from these sources, these deep well springs of tradition. So you're not just reading one poem, you're actually getting inducted into a kind of society, the society of arts and letters, which has been going on throughout time and space for generations and generations. And that in itself is an enormous gift. Leaving aside, you may love this poem, you may not love it as much as I do. That is important. It's important to develop your critical tastes and critical responses to works of art, but it's not the whole picture. I think nowadays we think that literature class or English class is just for you to come to like art. And we have this very self-centered view of works of art that what do they do for us? How can they make us happy or fill up our time or entertain us? And of course, they are there to do that. They're there to enrich us. But we, at the outset, don't stand in judgment over them. They have something to teach us. And this is an older idea of education. It's one that people don't like to hear about so much because it doesn't make you the judge, jury, and executioner. It makes the literature into something that stands over you in some sense. But it's a kind of arch or a shelter that stands over you. It's a castle that you can enter into. And in order to do that, you have to accept that this is not just a piece of art that you might evaluate on its own merits. It's also your ticket into a society that has inherent worth and a culture and a tradition that has inherent worth. But the good news is admission is basically free, or it costs as much as it costs to get a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I want to talk to you today about the wider background of myth. I did this in the Iliad too. I sort of walked us up to the opening of the story. In the Odyssey, it's a little different because we get these hints or these gestures out toward the larger mythic structure very early on. And we have the impression that Odysseus' journey is one, very extraordinary, but only one among a number of different myths that have spun out in the aftermath of the Trojan War. Once you get a handle on that, you'll have much firmer grounding if you want to go away and read the Greek tragedies, or maybe we'll do some other ancient poetry later on, and you'll have more of a sense of your bearings on the map. So let's get into it. But first, let me tell you about my sponsor, the Ancient Language Institute. This is the very beginning of a push that I'm going to make for you to sign up to take the Ancient Language Institute's spring term classes. Fall is now underway. We're teaching, those of us that are teaching for the fall semester, but we're looking ahead to spring term, and it's kind of distant now. The deadline is to sign up December 14th, but I'm letting you know now so that you can get a jump and get in ahead of the other folks. The Ancient Language Institute's classes always fill up, so you do want to get your name in. And you want to do that for another reason, which is these courses are so awesome. I mean, talk about getting a key into Western culture and into the club of high civilization. If you can read one of these languages, Latin, Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and now Anglo-Saxon that they teach there, you will have so much more immediate access, unmediated access to the great text. So you don't need to wait for some other guy to tell you about what Homer says, or what the Bible says, or what Beowulf says. You yourself can really get your hands on it and know it face to face. They teach these languages in exactly that way. So they teach you more intuitively than some of the other courses you might take, where you'd be memorizing a bunch of verbs and conjugations before you ever looked at a text. You're going to get right into the text really early on. They can help you out no matter what level you're at. If you already have some experience with these languages, you want to get better, or you're totally fresh and new to this whole experience and maybe even a little freaked out by the idea of learning a language, but you want to go deeper into this material, ALI is the place for you. The location, the link you got to go to is ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics. I'm going to put that in the description of this episode so you can click that link. But only by listening can you get the extra special sauce, and that is my name, SPENCER, Spencer, and you can put that in as a promo code and you'll get 10% off your registration fee at ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics. Sign up before December 14th to be included in their spring term. Okay, now, where were we? Telemachus has been fired up by Athena in the guise of Mentor, the OG Mentor, as in that's his actual name, not just the word that we then use to mean mentor. And Athena has bucked Telemachus up to get out of his bad situation at home, to stand up to the suitors, and to go looking for news of his father, which brings him to Lacedaemon, and that is the ancestral or the classical name of what we now call Sparta. And it was called Sparta, the city-state was also called Sparta in the ancient world, but Lacedaemon is referring to its more ancient heritage, and the area where Lacedaemon is called the Peloponnese. So these are really kind of the core OG city-states that we're going to be dealing with here. And a lot of these myths that Homer will allude to in the story are about places like Mycenae or Lacedaemon, or cultures and civilizations and city-states that predate the classical era and were major even before Greece was really Greece as a cogent entity. Remember that the idea of Greekness is taking shape over these centuries and doesn't really get locked in until the Persians invade and Athens and Sparta band together to fight back against this larger force. So what we're in a period now, Homer's composing probably around the 8th century BC. We're in a period where Greece is becoming self-aware and self-conscious, and we're hearkening back to an even earlier period, this Bronze Age era, when Mycenae was really the top of the heap. Now, Mycenae is kind of close, actually, to Sparta. If you think of the Peloponnese, it's that little peninsula that juts out from the mainland of Greece. So Athens is all the way to the east in the mainland, and then there's a very thin spit of land. You go past Corinth and you end up in the Peloponnese, where you have Mycenae, or what is now called Argos, and then you go further down into Sparta and the Peloponnese and Lacedaemon. It's called the Peloponnese because it's named after Pelops, one of the mythical legendary kings. And there's all these figures that kind of seem to be rooted somewhere in ancestral memory, not quite history yet, because they're out of the reach of the true historians like Herodotus and Thucydides from really giving us factual information about what was underlying here. But a lot of these myths do carry a certain sense that there's something about them that is true. They're founding myths or something. And they refer, of course, there are gods and there are heroes and all these people, but they also refer to real cultures that were self-aware as cultures and as civilizations within the larger Greek world. So we're going to end up in Sparta, which takes Telemachus basically down south east along the coast from Ithaca. And Menelaus, remember, is the king of Sparta. His wife is Helen, and it was his whole problem that started the Trojan War, that Helen got abducted by Paris. So in many ways, he's like the culprit of the whole thing. He and Helen are pretty manifestly unhappy, which stands to reason since she has now either betrayed him or been estranged from him for some period of time. But the poem, I think, and somebody was talking to me about this recently on my Substack, the poem seems to suggest that these two have restored a kind of order to their house, even though the underlying, beneath the surface, there's all this underlying history and tension. And Telemachus is there as kind of this representative of the new generation trying to close the one loop, the one gap. And when he asks Menelaus, Menelaus says, "Oh, good news. I actually have something to tell you about Odysseus." Because he had his own difficult journey back home. He was trapped for a while at Pharos, and that's in Egypt. So think now sort of to the south, right? He failed to make the right sacrifice, which is a kind of a motif that comes up in these stories from time to time. He learns about this through a nymph, a Dothe, whose father is Proteus. And you may know about Proteus because Proteus is where we get our adjective protean. Something that's protean is always changing. You can never quite nail it down. You might want to figure out its shape, but it might always be eluding that, which refers directly to this myth of the sea god Proteus. He has information, he has prophetic knowledge about how to get home and also about the rest of Menelaus' comrades from around the Greek world. But in order to get it, he's going to have to wrestle the wily old man into submission. One of the awesome stories, and this is a way in which you can see the Odyssey being kind of different from the Iliad off the bat, even before we get into Circe and the Cyclops and all those cool stories that we're going to start telling probably next week. The Iliad is much, much more comfortable in myth and legend and lore. And it's also more comfortable, I think, with origin stories. It's more concerned with origins because remember, the ultimate trajectory we're on here is who is Odysseus and who's he going to become in order to reintegrate into the nomos, the rituals and the customs and the laws of domestic life in a Greek-speaking world. Another really short way of saying that is how's he going to become civilized or re-civilized from his youthful days of war and trickery. And everybody in this poem is sort of concerned with that, and myth is one of the major ways that we still come to grips with those sorts of questions. We have to tell stories, not just history about what happened and where our traditions come from, but also legends and myths and patterns of fairy tale that give us a sense of the spiritual dimension of human life. Because in war, the spiritual stakes are pretty clear. They're real. You're fighting, you're going to die, and you have to fight to the death in order to achieve your kleos and your glory. In domestic life, every day, you and I don't really get up and play for mortal stakes. At least I hope you're not in that situation. Most of the time, we're making coffee, we're scrubbing the counter, we're going to work, we're talking to our kids, whatever it is that you and I and everybody is out here doing. We don't immediately grasp unless we have a larger story, unless we have a myth in the deep sense, not in the sense of a false story, but in the sense of a spiritual story about where we're going and what the purpose is of what we're doing. Everybody does this. calling it a myth is not to say that there's no truth in it, just to say that it operates on a symbolic plane to convey things that are more than material about the mundane, quotidian, material things that we do. So the Odyssey is very, very comfortable in the world of myth and legend, and this is one of the core myths. This, from a psychological perspective, this is something that's rooted very deeply, that having to nail something, not having to grasp onto a source of divine knowledge. It makes sense he's a sea god because water is always changing its shape. Menelaus lies in wait and grabs the sea god, holds him tight while he turns first into a lion, then into a snake, then into a leopard, then into a boar, and then back into water, which is, I guess, kind of his original form, and then into a tree, and finally gives up. There's an amazing little portrayal here of this old man. He has a flock of seals as if they were sort of sheep or dogs. It's kind of cute. And he's portrayed as basically just wanting to be left alone or to keep his secrets, but if you hold him down, he's sort of like the changelings in Star Trek. If you watched, I'm going to forget which Star Trek spinoff it is, and I'm sure somebody can write in to tell me, but the changelings are these goopy figures that kind of dissolve into this giant ocean of consciousness, but then come up as individuals and take on a quasi-human form. That's Proteus. He has a story to tell. In fact, multiple stories about all the different comrades that Menelaus has lost track of on his way home. Before he's going to give Menelaus himself his way home, Menelaus wants news of his comrades. And this is a motif that's going to come up again when Odysseus visits the underworld. These guys want to know. They want closure on their war buddies, basically, is one way of putting that. Very natural, recognizable human impulse. But Proteus does not have a lot of good news, in fact. He tells him first two stories about catastrophe, disaster, and death. And this is why I said, let's check back in. It's not going so well. First is the story of Ajax, which does come up in a tragedy by Sophocles. He died for boasting, basically. He bragged that he had escaped the difficulties of his journey without the help of the gods. And Poseidon says, "Oh, really? Did you think that we weren't involved?" And he destroys him on the cliffs of Gyrae, which is a very dramatic moment, but less perhaps significant or less generative of future art, so far as we know, than the next story, and that is the story of Agamemnon. Now, here we enter into one of two major mythic, they're called cycles, that is collections of stories, which each of which is interconnected, and you have kind of different family trees or family lines of myth that grow up around sort of the spine of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is one of them, which makes sense because, again, Agamemnon, remember, is king of Mycenae or Argos, and Argos, which is near to Sparta, because Sparta is ruled by Menelaus. Menelaus is Agamemnon's brother. Agamemnon rules Mycenae, Argos. Mycenae is the prime civilization in the period that Homer is hearkening back to. That is the Bronze Age period, sort of from the 1700s BC on to the 1000s BC. So the 18th to the 11th century BC, we have this real flourishing, actually. Before the High Classical period, it's sort of lost to history in many ways, but we know that Mycenae and Minoan Crete, which is the island way down to the south, were both centers of culture. It looks like they were court civilizations, that is, they were monarchic cultures centered around a court life. And Mycenae is one of the major ones, and that's why Agamemnon leads the troops to the Trojan War, because it's Menelaus' fight, but Menelaus' brother is the head honcho, really, of the whole thing. And so it stands to reason that there would spring up a large and elaborate mythology, founding mythology, really, around the rule and the dynastic line at Argos. The other major dynastic set of myths here is going to be Thebes. And I want to tell you both of these stories because they are each relevant for any other Greek literature or myth that you might want to study. There are obviously multiple different versions, but I'm going to tell you sort of the core versions and the ones that will come up if you go away, as you should, and read or watch Greek tragedies and that sort of thing. But the Odyssey version of the Agamemnon story, that is the Argos Mycenae story, is very bare bones. I mentioned this earlier. We get a speech from Zeus in book 1, where he says, men are always blaming the gods. They're shaking their fingers. We get no credit. We get such a bad rap, when really men bring their troubles upon themselves. Exhibit A, Aegisthus. And Aegisthus is the man that murders Agamemnon, the Mycenaean king, on his way home. He lies in wait in ambush, murders him, steals his wife Clytemnestra. And if you've seen any Greek tragedy, you might recognize a version of this story from Aeschylus' play Agamemnon. And that's part of the Oresteia, our only complete trilogy of Greek tragedies from the ancient world. And it's called the Oresteia because it leads up finally to the story that Zeus tells, which is that Orestes avenges his father Agamemnon's death by killing Aegisthus. And that's basically all we get. Clytemnestra's in there, but she's nothing like the femme fatale Lady Macbeth main character that she is in Aeschylus' story. So you might say that Homer is silencing women's voices, but actually I just think there are multiple different versions of this myth. The key is the Oresteia. It's the coming of age of Orestes in much the same way that Telemachus is now coming of age. He's having to avenge an injustice against his father. It's of a slightly different kind because it stretches back into this ancestral dispute over two different dynasties. So you have actually a number of these different kinds of founding myths, founding stories. I mentioned one already, Pelops in Lacedaemon or Sparta. There's Erechtheus in Athens, and later on Theseus is sort of regarded as the prototype of the democratic leader in Athens. But really the major ones are Mycenae and Thebes. And it's kind of interesting that these are both stories of blood guilt, of getting tangled in the interminable cycle of violence that comes from avenging the death of a father. Obviously, that's a very primal psychological story. It's also probably true to life. You notice that still today in lawless tribal strongman regimes, there are feuds stretching back generations and generations, and the Greeks, and in this stage of their history or their legendary past, are not that far off from kind of a tribal warlord situation. So it stands to reason that this would be the core moral issue and spiritual dilemma question that they were grappling with, was about how justice can bring peace, or how justice and peace can be combined when justice involves blood guilt. So I mentioned the Theban cycle. This is most famously the Oedipus story and the source of Freud's ideas about how we all regard our own fathers in our subconscious. Leaving that aside for a second, I actually think that the Oedipus story is a much more profound picture of mankind's cosmic situation and the difficulty of operating rightly in a world full of unknowns. And it's much more a story about the universe than it is about your particular inner state, but that's just leaving Freud kind of out for a second and taking a dig at him. If we put him aside, we see a much grander picture of first Laios, king of Thebes, who has this son, Oedipus, with his wife Jocasta, and Oedipus is prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother, which means that he ends up abandoned. He should have been killed according to the king's decree, but he was instead abandoned and passed off via shepherds to the king of Corinth. He's raised by the king of Corinth and makes his way back in an attempt to flee what he thinks is the meaning of the prophecy, because he thinks that he's the Prince of Corinth, so he doesn't want to kill his dad over there, ends up in fleeing, meeting his father Laios on the road, not knowing it's his father, killing him in an outburst and in a dispute, marrying his mother Jocasta after solving the riddle of the Sphinx, not knowing it's his mother. When this is revealed, he blinds himself, and this is probably the most famous Greek tragedy ever. That is Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. Now, Sophocles actually wrote 3 different tragedies about the Oedipus cycle. Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, was the most famous one. Then he dealt with kind of the fallout, the aftermath in different tetralogies, not in the same tetralogy as Oedipus the King, but there was Antigone, where he talks about the daughter, one of the daughters of Oedipus. He's got Oedipus. Oedipus has got Antigone, Ismene, his other daughter, Eteocles, and Polynices. And what happens after Oedipus cedes the leadership of Thebes to Creon is that, and Creon being his brother-in-law and I guess also uncle because he's Yocasta's brother, Creon takes over. Polynices and Eteocles are in this terrible dispute, and it's Polynices who is fighting to defend Thebes, essentially, while Eteocles stages basically a rebellion. This is the story of Seven against Thebes, and Creon's refusal to bury Eteocles as a traitor is what leads Antigone to defy the regime of Thebes in Antigone. Meanwhile, Oedipus in Colonus tells a kind of different story about how Oedipus himself finds a degree of closure. So there's this very elaborate architecture, and that's not all that we get in Thebes. We also get Euripides' Bacchae is set there. Aeschylus himself has a 7 against Thebes, which tells the Polynices Eteocles story. So this area, which is kind of near to Athens, so if Mycenae is the ancient ancestral area near to Sparta, then Thebes is northwest of Athens and also serves as kind of this mythical other place. So the Theban cycle will become important for the Athenian tragedians. But then you also have this Mycenaean or Argolid cycle. And this, as I say, is about a dispute over the hot seat, the throne itself, the top spot. Beginning not with Agamemnon or with Aegisthus, who shows up in the Odyssey first, but actually with their parents' generation. And that is a dispute, a struggle over the throne between Atreus and Thyestes. And that's why sometimes this is told as the story of the House of Atreus. If you saw The Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix, the House of Atreus has the same kind of ring to it. It's like a ghost story, a haunted house. In fact, that does turn out to be what it ultimately is in many of the tragedies. As I say, we get a very bare bones version of this story in the Odyssey, but enough to support all sorts of other mythological speculation. I will tell you the skeleton of how this story typically goes, with the caveat that there are always differences and retellings and so forth in any particular text you may encounter. But as I say, Atreus and Thyestes are in a dispute over the throne. And initially, the kickoff problem is that Aegisthus, who is the son of Thyestes, kills Atreus. And there are different versions of why he does this. Obviously, he wants his dad, Thyestes, to be in charge. So that's one motivation he has for killing Atreus. But another is that actually, Aegisthus is the only child left to Thyestes after Aegisthus commits one of the cardinal sins against the gods in all of Greek literature. There are some things that you can do in the Greek world that are so foul that nobody contests or argues about whether you were in the wrong, no matter what led up to them. One example of this is actually Achilles' slaughtering and then desecration of Hector's corpse, because Hector was a noble enemy, and desecrating a corpse is itself a kind of denial of the god's order of things, a refusal to allow human disputes to be settled and to return to the larger cosmic order of the gods. We talked about how Olympus intervenes in that moment, and that's the key marker that Agamemnon's rage has gone hypermetron, beyond its limits. Here we have another example of this feud, this dispute between these two rival leaders, also going beyond these limits into impiety. So even though the polytheistic world is perhaps a more morally ambiguous world, where different gods and powers might preside over different interests, and you might have competing or pluralist ideas about morality, there are some things which the whole company of heaven resounds against. And this notion of going beyond the boundaries of our humanity, either to Godhead or to bestiality, either down or up, is one of the key markers of impiety. It's one of the main ways that you can incur the wrath of all heaven. Atreus does it, and he does it by killing Thyestes' children and then tricking him into eating them. So cannibalism, which Aristotle actually talks about also in the Nicomachean Ethics, is one of the core examples of bestiality. So if Agamemnon descends, or Achilles rather, descends into bestiality with Hector's corpse. Atreus descends into bestiality with his hatred of Thyestes and offers even something perhaps lower or more grotesque than the beasts in this cannibalistic ritual. And so there are deep principles here of what it is to be human, of the Greek idea of our place in the universe, that make it disgusting in some ways for us to either transcend or abase ourselves beneath our humanity. There's something deeply wrong about that, worse than beasts and animals being animals. Animals can be animals. They can do stuff that looks lawless and ugly to us because they don't know any better, they don't have reason. But for a creature with reason, with the full use of logos, to descend to the behavior of the beasts and the savagery of the beasts is worse than if you had just never been a human at all. To fall is worse than to just be something lower. And that's what I think is being expressed here in this cardinal, this originary story. This part is not in Homer, to be clear. We only get sort of the fallout or the aftermath, but this will later become very important, and that's why the House of Atreus is haunted, because Atreus goes so far beyond the limits of what would be even acceptable within a dispute and within a conflict over lineage, that now there's a curse. There's a curse upon his line and his family forever. Aegisthus rises up and kills Atreus. This is actually what Zeus warns him not to do in the Odyssey, because he sends Hermes to say, if you do this, Orestes is gonna have to come back. So you'll be starting this blood feud, and Orestes is going to kill you, and then there will be a crisis. And that's the crisis that Aeschylus deals with ultimately in the Oresteia. But Aegisthus doesn't listen. He doesn't listen because he's got too much grievance now, too many things. Not only did he kill Atreus, Agamemnon's father, for this terrible offense, but Agamemnon then ousted him and took the throne. And so that's why when Agamemnon leaves for Troy, Aegisthus is lying in wait. And in the tragedy, this is sort of a peripheral motivation to Clytemnestra's anger about the slaughter of Iphigenia and some of the stuff we already covered on the Iliad episodes. But in the Odyssey, this is really central because voids of power vacuums, are really important to this poem. That this is in some sense a foil to the situation in Ithaca, where Odysseus, through no fault or only some fault of his own, has left this void open, this emptiness that he has to step into. And the urgency of what happens in those voids is dramatized by this story of Aegisthus and Orestes and Agamemnon and the terrible fate that some of the heroes of the Trojan War have met. This could not be more important or more profound as a statement about what kind of concerns Odysseus is dealing with. And this is why it matters what I said last week, that Odysseus is not named until very late in the poem. His name is constantly being contorted and twisted and punned and messed around with, because there's a void where he's supposed to be. There's an open spot on his throne in his house, and Telemachus is now reaching out into that void very touchingly and movingly to brush the fingers of his father, to try and find some news or some story, and that's what he gets next. So Menelaus goes through all these stories that he's told of the demise of Ajax and the demise of Agamemnon, and then he says, and that's when Proteus told me about your dad, about Odysseus. And I'm going to read to you the passage because it's really kind of fun and interesting for some of the reasons we've been talking about. As always, I'm translating this myself. Hope you enjoy. Here we go. These men I know indeed, says Menelaus to Proteus, as in, I know Ajax, I know Agamemnon, these men I know indeed, but you have to name the third, whoever he is, hostis eti. So again, Odysseus is this sort of void, this emptiness that needs filling. Whoever he is, still alive and penned in by the great wide sea, or dead, I want to hear it, despite how deeply it hurts. So I said, and he answered me once again with the following words. It's the son of Laertes, Huios Laerteo, whose home can be found in the land of Ithaca. Him I can see on an island, wetting the ground with hot tears, deep in the cavern halls of Calypso the nymph, who holds him by force, and he has no way to go back to the land of his fathers. He has no ships and no oars, no friends alongside him to row that could ferry him homeward again on the back of the great wide sea. So this is a foreshadowing. This is a little hint of where we're going to meet Odysseus next time. Remember, I said that he's kind of at the end of his voyage and his journey when we meet him, and he's going to give us a flashback of where he's been going this whole time. But he's held on the island of Calypso by some would say not particularly burdensome bond. That is this very beautiful immortal woman who wants to make him immortal, but he is so faithful to Penelope, standing at his mast while Penelope stands at her loom, and it's all very touching. And as I said before, there's this wonderful parallel that even though they're miles and miles apart, you can sort of picture them. If there were a movie of the two of them, they would be overlaid on top of one another. But we wouldn't understand the significance of this unless we had had these other stories about the other ways that men can go wrong on the way back home, and the wound that is opened up, not just physical wounds, but the spiritual and the civilizational wounds that are opened up when men go off to war. They leave gaps in society. This, by the way, is still true. If you think about what happened, for instance, during the World Wars that led to women having to go into the factories and take a place in industrial society, that prompted a whole bunch of other things that we're still living with. The transition out of the cottage industry, the breakup of the nuclear family, all of that was prompted in part by this hole that needed filling, the power vacuum that needed filling when the men went off to war. That's what this poem is also about. And so we're going to resume next week with the story of Odysseus himself. We've finally made it to the main event. This is the series where you're getting all the extra wiki back knowledge from your nerdy friend that loves every Marvel movie and has read every comic book. But I wanted to give you a situation here to situate you in what is called the mythic cycle. So I mentioned that each one of these threads of narrative can be called a cycle: the Theban cycle with Oedipus, or the House of Atreus cycle with Agamemnon. And the whole thing was gathered together by sort of your original extended universe nerds into one giant cycle. It's called the epic cycle. And that, in turn, is a Greek word, kyklos, which is where we get our word cycle, and it just means circle. It's a big, round orb encircling, in this case, the whole world. And it can be a cycle because it begins and ends in the same place. It can express a cyclical vision of the universe, like the one the Stoics had, that if you really told the whole story all the way out, it would be a snake eating its own tail that gets back to the beginning and starts over afresh. There were Greek ideas that might be how the whole universe was formed. But in a more modest compass, the mythic cycle or the epic cycle spins out from Homer and builds on with all these other little epics and myths and tragedies and stories. There's the Cypria, there's the Iliou-Persis, the sacking of Ilium, because remember, that part is skipped over in between the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's like a little bridge part. And later authors and poets would write different comic books, different epics, different poems, different stories to fill in the gaps in the cycle. Because once you start to collect this knowledge, you start to want to kind of bring it all into a unified field theory. And there's a really productive, I think, back and forth, which is part of why the comic book tradition in America, if I can call it that, has been so fertile, is there's always this back and forth between the little local patterns of storytelling and affection, where you have this little story we happen to tell in Arkansas about how Ma and Pa founded their homestead and how we're now here, and those stories get embroidered in different ways and fan fictioned out and told a million times in different forms. And there's that impulse, which is the original storytelling impulse, to give you the way it really happened in some self-contained unit. And then there's what I would think of as the scholarly impulse, or the completist's impulse, to make sense of everything, to have a governing theory of how these things fit together. And you start to see that impulse take hold in especially the Hellenistic era, which not coincidentally is also the era of the Library of Alexandria. So Hellenistic period after the classical period, death of Alexander, 323 BC. We've now fast forwarded way, way past the Bronze Age, when the Trojan War takes place around 1200 BC, up through Homer's day, the 700s BC, past the Persian Wars, past the classical period where you get the tragedies and you get Socrates and you get then finally the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, past the reign of Alexander the Great, up to this afterthought period. And it's one of my favorite periods of history because it's sort of a lull or a sigh in between the drama of classical Athens and Sparta and Macedon and Alexander and the new chapter of history, which is going to be Rome. And in the space between those two things, you have the Hellenistic era when Alexander's empire crumbles into a bunch of different territories, including Egypt under the Ptolemies, and Alexandria becomes this major source and center of learning in a way that Athens once was. You get kind of the center of gravity in the intellectual world starts to come to the library, and you have this very imperial impulse of bringing all the knowledge together, summarizing it, listing it all off. Now, this was part of Greek thought before that, and in some ways the precursor to the epic cycle of the scholars is Hesiod's Theogony, which is the first time that we know of that somebody tries to tell the story of the world from the very beginning. That is, from chaos and Uranus and Gaia and heaven and earth coming together and giving birth to the Titans and the Titans giving birth to the gods. And that's, Hesiod tells that story. But the scholars try basically to gather that story and to piece it together with everything else that we've been talking about, and this whole culture is looking back on itself and trying to make sense of how this can fit into a grand picture of the universe. That's the kyklos, that's the cycle. We have, for instance, Telemachus, one of the librarians of Alexandria, who put together what might have been the first comprehensive library catalog. It was called the Pinakes, and it was a bunch of tablets where he had listed out all the different stuff, the catalog of what was in Alexandria, much of it sadly now lost, but known to us by report. Then, really, as this project starts to take hold, it gets its highest artistic expression in Ovid's Metamorphoses, if you've ever heard of that, later on under Augustus and the Roman Empire. Of course, Rome is really going to take this project to a whole new level of gathering the world under one order, one cosmos, one heaven. And if you're a Christian, it's very interesting that that's what Rome had in mind, since, of course, we're getting up now on the date of the birth of Christ. And if you, like me, you believe in the providence and the plan of God, you can see that all of world history is kind of leading to this point where people are starting to think, what's the order of things? Let's make a real attempt at bringing order to the world. And it's no accident that Christ is the alternate to Augustus, a totally different, almost inverted vision of power and order and glory and what the world ought to look like. It's often been noted that Virgil, in one of his minor poems, gives a description of a ruler who sounds a lot like Jesus. And sometimes people think, well, was Virgil kind of a prophet? And maybe, but maybe he was just describing what everybody was waiting for, holding their breath for in that moment, somebody who could bring order. And Augustus claimed to be it. Christ claimed that he was really it. And afterward, as Rome got taken over by Christianity from the inside out, this was one of the great claims of Christian belief, that you could see Christ's victory in his having ultimately won the contest for governing the world and bringing order and making sense out of everything. But before that, there was the kyklos, there was the epic cycle. We know about this in part through one manuscript. It's called Venetus A, from much later, but recording a commentary on the Iliad, which in turn records something called the Chrestomathi. And the Chrestomathia is a Greek word meaning desire for learning. Looks like it probably comes from the 2nd century AD. It's attributed to this guy Proclus. Proclus was a later disciple of Plato, but we think this is probably a different Proclus, an earlier one, who had this impulse to stitch all the different stories together into one. I have a very, if you can't tell, deep affection for Chrestomathies and for this particular Chrestomathy and for the impulse to gather all the stories into one. And if I had to say why, it's because I think the concept of the Chrestomathy is really my inner child expressing itself in its purest form. My dad tells this story about his childhood when he was a kid, putting together his action figures and making them tell stories. And he thinks that this is sort of a pure, unadulterated expression of his created self, that he's always had a soul, even before it was distorted by psychology and as we all go through traumas and different events. And so underneath even sort of the sin of the world, there's this core self that my dad always talking about, and it is expressed for him in this childhood story of playing on the floor with blocks and telling stories. My version of that is a memory I have of being a little kid in our flat in London and reading series of books like the Animorphs series, if you guys were into that back in the day, or Goosebumps, or the series of Unfortunate Events. I mean, there were a bunch of these, and I was such a completist about them. I wanted every different installment, and the Harry Potter books when they came along, and all these different ones were just so fascinating to me. And they were fascinating because I liked reading, but they were especially fascinating because I would sit on my floor and make catalogs of them. I would array all the different books and put them in order and think of different ways to arrange the story, kind of like I've been doing here with you on this podcast as I tell you different parts of the story and try to organize the whole thing and give you a comprehensive sweep and picture. So for me, this is who I was meant to be. This is sort of my inner child, is the Chrestomathic scholar that wants a picture, wants to zoom out and organizes and takes such pleasure in just seeing things fit into place. Hopefully you enjoy it too. I just think once that stuff slots in, that's that aha moment feeling where you realize that all of the different disparate stories you've been told and maybe the references that your smart friends make aren't just things people say to sound fancy. They are little grappling hooks or footholds and handholds in the vast climbing wall and network of knowledge. And getting a handle on that knowledge and that network gives you freedom to then move where you will. So hopefully now that you have this landscape of the cycle and of the larger mythological picture that the Greeks themselves were building and knew they were building, now you can have some access to that part of the territory. And that's not the only territory in Western civilization. There's a whole biblical history to deal with, and there's all the European stuff afterward, and we'll probably move on to talking about that, honestly, when we're done talking with Homer, because I've been having so much fun with this. But this, at least, is one entry into a major wing of the edifice of Western civilization. That's one major reason why we read Homer at all, besides the fact that it's just rip-roaring fun and cool. So, like I say, next week we're on to the story of Odysseus himself and all the most famous legends of the poem. But first, I would like to take a mailbag question. So mailbag questions come to me through Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. If you have any questions at all, or just feedback, thoughts about which episodes you like, what topics you want to cover, and where you'd like to go from here, I welcome those. I can't always respond to all of them, but I'm very grateful for anything you send me through Substack. So you go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com, you send me a DM, or I send out a Friday email every week, and you can just respond to that if you want with your questions. And today's question from Dan is actually in response to one of my Friday essays. So I'll post this link as well in the description of the show, but I wrote an essay called If, Then, and Now, which was a sort of analysis of the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. I will also link to that poem. It's an incredible poem, really good one to memorize because it has actual good advice in it. It's a father talking to his son about, if you do this, if you do that, then you will be a man. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, yet make allowance for their doubting too. So that gives you a flavor for the poem. And then at the very end, he says, if you do all these things, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. So great, great poem, and routinely the favorite poem of the public at large when polled. And that's kind of what the piece was about. It was about the fact that this poem, which is not sophisticated and fancy and full of allusions and modernist and feels very out of its time in 21st century America and Europe, is more beloved than all the fun T.S. Eliot poems that nerds like me cherish and pride ourselves in being able to understand and enjoy. And this drives intellectuals insane. People are constantly accusing Kipling of the worst stains and sins. Orwell said it was impossible not to find him grotesque. And, you know, he was a character of empire. He was not an unqualified admirer of all things the British Empire did, but he did believe in the civilization building project, and he did believe in that, so it's easy now to scorn him, and it's easy to make fun of his poetry, which T.S. Eliot himself sort of did. He gave a very dismissive evaluation of this poem as good, bad poetry. And on the one hand, I really take umbrage at that, because I love the poem, and because I think it's actually better than it may seem. I used to sort of agree with Eliot that this really isn't a very good poem in some deep sense, but that it's still kind of a guilty pleasure, or it's enjoyable. But now I think, no, the form of the poem, the thudding rhythm and meter, the fatherly tone of it can be grating, but it's grating in exactly the way that fatherly advice can sometimes be grating. That is, it's exactly what you need to hear, but maybe not what you want to hear right now. It's not fancy. It's not always poetic in the highfalutin sense, but once you have it running through your head, you will thank God for it when you need it. It's like the bottle of water that somebody hands you at the base of the trail, and then you get up there and you're like, thank God I took this with me. Thank God I took Rudyard Kipling's If with me, because there are, of course, moments when all about you are losing their heads and blaming it on you. There are moments when you meet with triumph and disaster, and you have to treat those two imposters just the same. And it's easy to sit in your study in a quiet hour and prefer some more elegant turn of phrase. But in real life, when you go out there and life gives you hard knocks, Kipling's If, rather, is sort of indispensable, invaluable. So I wrote this essay about why Kipling's If is great and why people don't want to like it. And Dan wrote in with a really great question, which is, what makes something good, bad poetry? That is, what are we reacting to when we see that something is awesome, but we sort of don't want to like it? So another way I think of asking this question is, why are some pleasures guilty? And I've always felt like, actually, if you take a pleasure in something and you're not hurting anybody and it's not hurting you or degrading you, it's not beneath you, then you shouldn't be guilty. Like, I would call football my guilty pleasure because it's not productive, but it's a pleasure. And as long as I'm not doing it too much, as long as it doesn't fall short of what it's supposed to be in some way, then I'm not guilty about liking football. I just find it a diversion. But there is that feeling that we have, and you can't deny that makes us instantly know what Eliot means when he calls If a good, bad poem. And George Orwell, in his essay about Eliot's essay about Kipling and If, said that good, bad poetry is a monument to the obvious. And by that he meant that it doesn't tell you anything you don't know, it doesn't surprise you, it's actually quite formulaic and rote, but the formulaic and the rote is there for a reason. The truisms, the aphorisms that we all know, and the basic conventional wisdom is wisdom. That's why everybody says it. So most of the time you do need the best possible expression of that. And he had some respect for that, Orwell did. And I do think there's something to that we can't only ever be breaking the rules, experimenting, doing clever, ironic stuff. In order for any of that to work, there has to also be a center, that is a society and rules about how you write poetry and conventional morality and taste and aesthetics. And artists are very, very allergic to this because their job is to play around the edges, to open up avenues of thought and insight and vision that the mainstream culture doesn't allow for, to tell you something new. Remember what Telemachus says, that men always love neo tate, the most new song. There's a reason for that, which is artists make rules for the purpose of breaking them. They create structures like poetic verse so that you can see the meaning that they're trying to express when they go outside of that structure. And this is not just true of avant-garde, weird pomo artists. This is true of Shakespeare. If you read Shakespeare's sonnets, you think, wow, here's the man that perfected the sonnet, and there's not one sonnet in here that doesn't break the rules somehow, that doesn't have a line that plays with the meter or sort of defies the particular rules of what's supposed to happen at this particular line. And that's because the structure is already there in place. It's been formed over centuries by the Italian poets like Petrarch, and then by the English poets like Thomas Wyatt and Chaucer. And then when Shakespeare comes to it, one reason why he's able to make the pinnacle of the sonnet is because he has that established layer of bedrock meaning, and he can play with it. So artists always want to be the ones playing with the rules and breaking them, never the ones writing or expressing the rules, which means that when somebody comes along that's really, really good at writing or expressing the rules, they sort of think it's beneath them. And of course, then there's a social element too, where when somebody gives you the core of conventional morality in a wholesome and direct way, then everybody can get behind that. We all love the good truisms of conventional morality, or many of us do, and they're very meaningful to ordinary people who live their lives by the conventions of healthy society, as they should. That's what society is there for. It's to lay out a pattern or a blueprint or a script for your life that will work for most people. And since it works for most people can appreciate Kipling. And this also drives intellectuals insane, because we want to be the guy who's read the poem you haven't read. Oh, sure, you like Depeche Mode, but well, have you heard of Vampire Weekend or whatever? I'm not hip enough to make up a good band that would fit there, but artists are hipsters. We like, and intellectuals too, we like to cite things that you haven't heard of before, and some new insight that shows we really have a wide grasp of knowledge and unique and interesting taste. So all of that, I think, is part of what makes good bad poetry is that it doesn't fit with what poets and artists tend to prefer, but rather with what most people tend to like. But there's something else beyond Orwell's insight that I want to bring up here. And that is that technically, I think, good bad poetry breaks the rules of poetry. That is, it doesn't do what you expect a really great poet to do. It doesn't come up with new insight. It doesn't embroider. It doesn't play. It really gives it to you straight. And people with taste, and taste is real, people with taste are looking for something that sparks a new light in them. And I want to say that that's not totally a matter of arrogance. There can be a lot of arrogance mixed up in it, but it is also a real element of being cultivated and developing your artistic sensibilities. Is when you first read any poem, you're like, wow, what is this? Poetry, rhymes, meter. And then as you read more and more, you start to refine and bring into focus exactly what it is that sparks or lights something within you, opens your mind, gives you new insight. And when you have a clearer and clearer picture of that, you start to get more and more refined. You can tell good from bad with more nuance. And that's real. Good and bad are real. There is such a thing as artistic taste. It does need to be trained. It's not just something that you can do from within you. And that's one reason why you can't just decide whether you don't like or do like the Odyssey or the Iliad. You have to read them and then get to know the world that they're in, and then make your critical judgments from within your aesthetic and artistic training. So those are all real rules, I guess is what I'm saying. And if breaks them, it is immediately accessible. It doesn't do much that is new. It's kind of plodding and thumping. And I suspect that guilty pleasures, the sensation we have of a guilty pleasure, is when we know that something isn't actually doing much according to the actual rules of poetry or of art or of anything else, but it still is doing something so well that it pleases us because it's giving us just undeniable value. Dan also mentioned Gone with the Wind, which I think is a good example because it's kind of melodramatic and it breaks all the rules of cinema. Actually, The Matrix is another good example where there's all sorts of scenes in The Matrix that if you took them into a workshop, somebody would say, this breaks the basic rules of making movies. There are long scenes where people explain abstract philosophy and go into these abstruse concepts, and it's a lot of info dump and a lot of exposition before we get to the fighting. And then the fighting is also sort of schlocky. I mean, there are all sorts of critiques you could give of The Matrix, and none of them matter. So it's when something breaks through the generally true statements that we can say about quality and refinement and artistic sensibility that we sense it as a guilty pleasure, or we have that feeling of it as good, bad art, poetry, whatever. And I don't think we should be guilty about that. In fact, I think we should be humble enough to learn from it. And what we learn, I suspect, is that all of the generalities and generalizations that we're able to make about what makes good art, even as very sophisticated critics, all of those generalizations are only generalizations. And like a mathematical model or a map, they can't perfectly capture the territory, because if the territory could be captured that way, we wouldn't need art in the first place. The human soul is infinitely varied, and there are as many routes to joy and delight as there are people. So of course you're going to come across outliers that break the rules, and sometimes they break the rules in ways that would make any other work of art seem schlocky and crude and bad. And there's no explanation for that, which is another reason why critics and intellectuals like me don't like this, is we want to be able to explain why this happens, but it might just be that Kipling just did it good. And I wanted to read to you a passage in closing from The End of That Hideous Strength, which is a wonderful novel by C.S. Lewis. And Lewis relates this phenomenon in art and in human aesthetics, importantly, to physics, of all places, where he says physics also has rules. There are laws of nature. And we are always making generalizations that hold good in certain domains, but also we are always encountering outlier phenomena that seem to explode our laws. And here's what Lewis's characters have to say about that. There's a miracle that occurs, or there's something uncanny that occurs where the main character, Ransom, doesn't age. He says, I have not grown a day or an hour older since I came back from Perilander, that's Venus. There is no natural death to look forward to. The wound will only be healed in the world where it was got. And then McPhee, who's sort of the skeptic of the group, says, all this has the disadvantage of being clean contrary to the observed laws of nature. Then Grace Ironwood, one of the visionaries of the book, says, it is not contrary to the laws of nature. You are quite right. The laws of the universe are never broken. Your mistake is to think that the little regularities we have observed on one planet for a few hundred years are the real, unbreakable laws, whereas they are only the remote results which the true laws bring about more often than not, as a kind of accident. And then Dimble, who is the literary Arthurian scholar, says Shakespeare never breaks the real laws of poetry, but by following them, he breaks every now and then the little regularities which critics mistake for the real laws. As in physics, where our laws are always only generalizations over the regularities that we can see from our human vantage point, so too in literature, critical truisms are true in most cases, but can always be broken through by a poet with a through line, a direct short circuit to the source of truth and goodness and beauty. And sometimes you get somebody that really just delivers, and if you're smart, you won't deny that. You will learn from it that your laws and your rules are not the point. The reality that your rules describe are the point, and insofar as they're helpful for describing it, you should use them and communicate them, and insofar as they're not, you should throw them out the window, because if is obviously a great poem, and if you can't see that, then you're too married to your little critical ideas and theories than you are to actual poetry, which is supposed to be the point. Okay, thanks for that great question, Dan. One more time, if you want to ask me a question, you can always go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and get in touch with me. Also, please don't forget to review this podcast 5 stars if you like it, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. That helps to get this out to more and more people. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.